So we were talking in the last class meeting about how different ideologies, different systems of political thought. Remember, we defined an ideology as a more or less consistent set of beliefs about the purposes and scope of government. And, maybe with particular thought, thinking about the emphasis on those words more or less. I think I even italicized them in the definition that I put up there on the screen, because I'm trying to draw your attention to the reality that some ideologies are more coherent than others, okay? But more importantly, it's not just random thought. It's not just random ideas about the purposes and scope of government. There are these logical interconnections among these assumptions. And we also spent quite a bit of time in the previous class meeting talking about the fact that whatever ideology it is that we're talking about, liberalism or communism or anarchism or whatever the ism, is ultimately premised on some assumptions about human nature. So we ran through the assumptions of liberalism about human nature. I'm not going to go back through all of that again, but this should look familiar to you because we talked about it previously. We also said that those assumptions about human nature lead to a second set of assumptions about social life and social relationships, and then you get to the assumptions about the purposes of government and the scope of government's authority. Why do we have government? What are the purposes of government? And how much authority, that's the scope of governmental authority, how much authority should government have to fulfill those purposes or that purpose? Okay? Now, just to keep it as simple as possible, what we've said here is that liberalism, traditionally, classically, liberalism has argued that government's purpose is to secure individuals in their rights by nature. Liberals assume that the laws of nature, Jefferson tells us in the Declaration of Independence that the laws of nature dictate. Okay? Just like there are certain immutable laws of nature governing the physical universe. Right? We don't want to jump ahead because we're going to have some discussion specifically about the Age of Enlightenment, but this period of Western history that gives rise to these liberal ideas is a very fertile intellectual period. It's not only the period of John Locke. The Age of Enlightenment is not only the age of John Locke and Denis Diderot and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and some of those others that I showed you last time. It is also the period in which scientists in the natural sciences are making these profound development, we're having these profound development. It's the age of Newton. It's the age of Locke. It's the age of Newton, right? And in a very similar way that Newton laid out these laws of motion that are the result of the natural order of the universe, right? Like the law of gravity, Locke, his contemporary at Oxford, is embracing the idea that the laws of nature also dictate that human beings have certain rights. And the Americans, 80, 90 years later, love that notion. They love that idea. Jefferson and the others just jump all over that. And that's why Jefferson says in the Declaration of Independence, the laws of nature dictate. Okay? So that's really the core of liberalism, this idea that individuals have certain rights by nature, and it's government's purpose to secure individuals in their rights. But as I told you last time, and we do need to move on, break new ground, liberals of that era also assumed that government was the principal threat to the rights of individuals. It's government's purpose to secure individuals in their rights, but it is also the principal problem. Government is the principal problem. It is, let me just sort of redirect our attention here for a second. It is what I like to refer to as Madison's dilemma. Okay? Madison, like Jefferson and most of the other Americans, made these kinds of assumptions. I refer to it as Madison's dilemma because, of course, Madison is the one who is credited as most succinctly stating this problem when he wrote that if men were angels, government would be unnecessary. Okay? So if we kind of boil that idea down to its basic premises and conclusions, it goes something like this. Okay? Here's the actual quote. That's a summary notion up there at the top. The actual quote is, if angels were to govern men, I really wish this was right on farther because, and I apologize if I feel like that. Is don't need the actual quote. If you want the actual quote, you can go out and Google it, right? If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls of government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place you must oblige it to control itself. That's Madison from Federalist number 51. Okay? So what that argument basically comes down to is this, is a couple of ideas. First of all, it says something about the nature of human beings. He says men are not angels. Human beings are not angels. They don't have divine nature. They have human nature. What does that mean? Oh, they're rational and self-interested and acquisitive by nature. They're naturally competitive. And they may have certain rights by the laws of nature, but that doesn't mean that they respect each other's rights. Okay? That's the basic assumption that the American founders made about human beings. Okay? So, because your rights as an individual are under some threat by the random assaults and injuries of your fellow human beings, they may steal from you, or they may assault you, or they may kill you, worst case scenario, right? We have to have government to protect you against those assaults and injuries of those otherwise rational and self-interested and acquisitive and competitive individuals. Okay? However, in creating a government, we must recognize that government is simply composed of human beings. We tend to think about government as this sort of faceless institution, as this institutional arrangement, but it's just people. And the people who occupy positions of government authority have the same nature as everybody else. They're rational and self-interested and acquisitive by nature. They're naturally competitive. And they don't necessarily respect your rights. Okay? The problem for the ordinary citizen is that whereas Joe Problem on the street represents a potential threat to your life, liberty, and estate, the people who occupy positions of government authority potentially represent a much bigger threat to your life, liberty, and estate because the power of government is potentially concentrated. So, the answer for Madison and the other Americans of that era is we have to have a constitution. The answer is constitutionalism. And we're not ready to talk in detail about the notion of constitutionalism. We do. A big chunk of this course is about American constitutionalism, but we're not quite there yet. So let's just say for now that what constitutionalism means is a recognition that you have to place arbitrary limits on the power of government. If you are inclined to believe that there should be no limits on the power of government, that government should be able to assume any authority that it so chooses, there's no point in having a constitution. The whole purpose of having a constitution is to impose restraints on the power of government. And that certainly is consistent with what Americans of that era believed to the person across the board. Okay, so all of that, all of these notions that we're talking about, human liberty, rights of individuals, constitutional government, all that kind of stuff those are really the key principles of liberal political thought. The American founders were liberals. We also, in the last class meeting, began talking about some alternatives to liberalism. I think, we're making some progress talking about the assumptions of anarchism, right? Anarchism is a system of political thought that emerges really towards the tail end of the 19th century. Liberalism emerges in the 18th century and into the 19th century at the time of the founding of the American nation. But anarchism comes along some decades later. Really, its origins, I guess, probably go back as far as the early 1900s or early 19th century. But in any kind of organized sense, anarchist ideas were a little bit later, towards the end of the 19th century. Okay, and since I showed you some prominent liberal thinkers like Locke and Diderot and Rousseau and Jefferson and so on. Why not show you a few prominent anarchist thinkers of that era? You have, I think I might have referred to Emma Goldman back in the last class meeting, but here are some others. Would be Lucy Parsons is another key one, Nestor Makhno, Alexander Berkman. Okay, so these are just a few names. I don't anticipate that you'll see questions on an exam that would test you, be designed to test to see if you know that Alexander Berkman was an anarchist. Okay, but just kind of give you some context. Okay, so what were the common assumptions that anarchists made about human nature? Well, they're naturally good, intelligent, reasonable, and mutually concerned about each other's well-being. And these are qualities of human nature that are evident when people are not encumbered by arbitrary rules. So remember we said last time that anarchism is a system of thought that advocates anarchy. Okay? Now, I think one bit of evidence that most Americans, past and present, have not been anarchists is the way that we understand sort of the popular association that we have with anarchy. If you're watching the news story, do any of you watch televised newscasts anymore, or is that just to your father's thing, right? You've seen one, right? Whether you watch them daily or not, you've seen a newscast. So you're watching a newscast and you see a report that's being aired, and the reporter is standing on the street corner, and in the background you see buildings on fire, and you see rocks and bricks being hurled, and bottles and Molotov cocktails and so on. And the reporter, ducking, trying to make sure, says, "The streets of the city are in a state of anarchy." Right? He or she is not saying that we have fun. Here's what he or she's not saying. We have finally achieved that state of being that we have longed for. Lo, these many hundreds of thousands of years of human struggle, we have finally achieved the anarchist goal. Right? That's not the way you understand the use of that term anarchy. Most Americans understand it to mean a collapse of order, a complete collapse of order, chaos. Right? That's not the way anarchists understand anarchism. True anarchists don't understand anarchism as a collapse of order. They understand it as the removal of arbitrary limits on human freedom, which means doing away with hierarchically organized paternalistic government. So when anarchists advocate the condition of having no government and no laws, it's because they believe that the presence of hierarchical paternalistic government is an impediment to the true nature of the human being. And you can't observe true human nature unless you get rid of that. I told you last time, I remember telling you last time that anarchists, in fact, argue that the only reason that we have ever had government
is to impose a class system.
Thank you. Good. Good memory. Right? So, that's the basic notions underlying anarchist political thought. Okay, so questions about anarchism? All right, let's give you one other alternative, sort of the other extreme. Here are some assumptions made by classical organic conservatism. And again, this is not the use of the term conservative like we would use it in the popular political parlance of the early 21st century when we talk about liberals versus conservatives in American politics. Actually, let me just jump ahead and show you some of the key people first. This is a system of thought that actually traces its roots back to the beginnings of Western civilization. Right? Certainly at least to the ancient Greek philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, okay, and through the Middle Ages, St. Augustine of Hippo and Thomas Aquinas, and into the early modern period with Thomas Hobbes, the British philosopher, and you see the Roman Cicero and Cato the Elder, right? These are the kinds of assumptions that were made going back to the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans through the Middle Ages and up to the early modern period. So classical organic conservatism actually has a much deeper history, a much longer history in Western civilization than liberal political thought. Liberal political thought has really only been around for about the last 300 years. Conservative political thought goes back a couple of millennia. So what are the kinds of assumptions that classical organic conservatism commonly makes about human nature? Well, human beings are more emotional than they are rational. They are self-indulgent and incapable of making important decisions about how they will be governed. By their nature, people are driven by the desire to seek pleasure and avoid pain. That's the hedonism principle. They're like sheep. Most people are like sheep. All they care about is seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. And certainly conservatism assumes that talents and intelligence and talents are not evenly distributed. Now, just because I've listed that here as an assumption of classical organic conservatism doesn't mean that liberals would dispute that intelligence and talents are not evenly distributed. I think liberals recognize that. I think probably most of us today recognize that. Clearly not all people have the same intelligence and talents. But it's the logical extension of that, or kind of the next step that's important as we talk about conservative political thought. So when they get to their assumptions about social life and social relationships, they assume that the irrational hedonistic masses must be guided by the few that have the wisdom and the talent so that the needs of society as a whole can be served. Can you appreciate that this is a perfect defense of aristocratic power and privilege? If you begin by assuming that most people are just sheep and they have to be led, and only a few people have the intelligence and talents necessary to make governing decisions, you can't get to democracy from there. There is no way. It's a dead end. You can't get to democracy. In fact, democracy as we understand it in the modern world is really an extension of liberal assumptions about human nature, that human beings, individuals, are the best judge of their self-interest. But conservatism has a much different view. How will we know who has the talents and intelligence necessary to govern? Oh, by birthright. They'll be born into their station in life. They'll be noble by birth. Consequently, there's going to be a class system. There's necessarily social stratification. What a perfect defense of the feudal and manorial arrangements that dominated Western civilization for so many centuries up until the Age of Enlightenment. When less than 2% of the population was noble by birth and had all the power and the wealth and controlled and dominated the lives of the 98+% of the population that was peasant. So then finally, when we get to the assumptions, conservatives get to the assumptions about why we have government and how much authority government should have, it goes something like this. Government's responsibility is to forcibly impose order on society in a paternalistic, hierarchical fashion, like parents making rules for their children. The masses are actually happiest in such an arrangement because their survival and well-being are guaranteed by a government vested with such authority. That idea, I think, was probably best and most succinctly expressed by the British philosopher Thomas Hobbes. There you see Hobbes, who wrote a classic in Western political philosophy called The Leviathan, who lived in the late 16th and 17th centuries. Hobbes is famous for that line, "In a state of nature, life is nasty, brutish, and short." Of course, he develops that idea, but basically what he means by that is human nature is such that if you can imagine human beings existing in a state of nature where you don't have civilized society, where you don't have government, for example, and it's just sort of every man for himself, or every person for himself or herself, the law of the jungle, so to speak, right? What people are mainly concerned about under those conditions is just surviving. You have to really watch your back. Not only might animal predators get you, but other human predators might get you, right? So if we would like to develop civilization, if we would like some of the finer things that civilization brings, like pursuit of the sciences and the arts and culture, what we have to have is a forcible government to impose order on society. The order doesn't just take care of itself. Okay? So that is the key difference, I think, between conservative political thought as we're talking about it versus liberal political thought as we're talking about in the classical usage of those terms. Okay? Again, not in the contemporary sense that we talk about Republicans being conservatives and Democrats being liberals. That's not what we mean here. Okay, questions about any of these conservative ideas? Okay, so let's go back to our definition of an ideology. An ideology is a more or less consistent set of beliefs concerning the purposes and scope of government, why we have government, how much authority government should have. We've said that an ideology is premised on some set of assumptions about human nature, social life and social relationships, and then ultimately the purposes and scope of government. Now we have this concept that we need to define, and I think this is fairly consistent with the definition of political culture that the authors of your textbook provide. It's not verbatim, but I think it's pretty consistent. Okay? Political culture is the set of political values, beliefs, and norms found in a political community which flow from the basic ideological assumptions about human nature, society, and government. We can talk about a political community, and in the United States we have different levels of political community. We have a national political community. We have state, political communities organized at the state level and at the local level. And when you take your Government 2306 course, you'll probably get some discussion of how, for example, the political values that Texans embrace are somewhat different than the political values that people from, say, Vermont embrace, right? Or New York, right? And you probably have some intuition about that anyway, right? But since this is a course in the American national system, we're going to focus our discussion just on the national political culture. And what I'm trying to tell you through this definition is that Americans, generally speaking, despite all of the diversity of American political life, embrace a core set of values. There's a document that I prepared for you and linked up for you as part of your reading assignment for week 1 and week 2. It's called Inventory of American Political Culture. I hope that you have read that. Treat that as part of the in-class discussion, because you could see questions on the first test based on that document. Okay? Among the values, and I'm not going to go through them all here because I prepared that document for you for that purpose, right? But liberty, order, equality, justice, rule of law, localism, republicanism, competitive individualism, private property rights, localism, national unity. There are others, but those are the core values of the American liberal political culture. With particular emphasis, if we wanted to make a list of most important, certainly at the top of the list, I think we have to put the value of individual liberty. So one of the things that I like to try to suggest about thinking about liberal political thought, really any ideology, but for our purposes, liberalism is the key system of thought, Think about it as being composed of two levels or two layers of thought. There's a core, fundamental level assumptions. What do these have to do with? Human nature, society, the purposes and scope of government. And in American political life, we don't really debate that. We don't really have political debate at this level. Americans don't really sit around over the dinner table or in cafes or coffee shops debating the fundamental nature of human beings. Have any of you done any traveling anywhere in the world besides the United States? Maybe you can testify to this, I don't know, but certainly it has been my experience in traveling internationally that, for example, you travel through Europe, you might overhear conversations among people your age sitting around in cafes or coffee shops where they do engage in a much more fundamental level of ideological discussion. Some of my European friends are quick to remind me, at least take a shot at me, I think, that the fact that Americans don't really talk about these kinds of things is evidence from their point of view that Americans are not very thoughtful. We're not very reflective people. We just are Pollyanna-ish kind of, and my response to them is, it's not that Americans are stupid or not thoughtful about these things. It's that we don't have to sit around and discuss these things. We sorted it out at the founding. And Jefferson told us in the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident. So if they're self-evident truths, why sit around and debate them and discuss them? I think more importantly for our purposes here, my European friends notwithstanding, for our purposes, what it tells us is that the political debate and the political discourse and discussion that we get in the American system isn't over fundamental assumptions. We do get debate and discussion at this level of political thought, a superficial level, right? Although it's really not a debate over whether these are values or whether they should be treated as values. It's really more of a debate over two things. First of all, if there's a conflict among these values, how do you prioritize them? If we see a conflict between liberty and order, or between equality and liberty, or order and justice, whatever the combinations might be here, and we do, a lot of issues in American political life can be thought of in terms of a conflict among these values. Everything from how much of our resources we're going to devote to national defense and anti-terrorism activities, for example, or maybe more domestically police protection on the one hand versus freedom of speech and freedom of association and right to privacy and all that sort of stuff on the other hand, ultimately comes down to the conflict between these, right? So we do get those kinds of debates in American political life. Which gets a priority? Is it more important, for example, to restrict privacy and freedom generally in order to preserve national security? Or is it more important to maximize individual liberty, and as a result you understand that there are going to be some breaches of national security? It's been an ongoing problem. It's not a problem that has just emerged with debate over a wall. We also get debate over how you reconcile the value with the reality. Because with any of these, okay, many Americans embrace the value, but when they look around and see what's going on around them, they say, well, that's not what we really have. The value of justice, for example, or equality, either one of those would be great illustrations. Most Americans embrace the value of equality. Right? Are all people equal? Are they treated the same? Should they be treated the same? Should they have equal opportunities? Pretty universally, Americans will say yes, but if you ask people, do we have true equality of opportunity? Do we have true equal treatment under law, etc.? The consensus breaks down real quick. So then the debate becomes, how do you pursue these values as a matter of policy? What do you do as a matter of policy to square the reality of justice with the value of justice. Look, there's really one of two ways that we can approach this. If we have this value of justice up here, we have some concept of justice up here, how justice is supposed to work. You can talk about this narrowly in terms of the criminal justice system, or more broadly about maybe the concept of social justice. Whichever way you mind, whatever you want to focus on, right? Okay? We have this value of justice up here. Maybe with the criminal justice system, part of that is the notion that the law should apply the same to everyone, regardless of race, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of income level, regardless of celebrity status, etc. Right? We have this ideal of how justice is supposed to work, but we look at what actually happens in the criminal justice system and say, well, that's not actually how it works. Okay? So the question then becomes, well, what do you do as a matter of policy in order to reconcile those two? And as I started to say, finish that thought, I think there are two basic approaches. One, if you see that gap, you observe that gap between justice and the ideal of justice and the reality of justice, or the ideal of equality and the reality of equality. One approach would be to kind of throw up our hands and say, well, we have this nice notion of justice here, but the reality, so why don't we just get real and, forget about this naive notion of justice we have. I don't think Americans typically do that. I hope that we haven't got to that point in our civil society, that we abandon our ideas. I think it's more likely that we try to find some way to reform justice, the reality of justice, to bring it up to this ideal. Equality is the same thing. Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. Did he mean, and if we want to be gender non-specific, they're all human beings who are created equal? Did he mean in the late 18th century when he wrote those words that all human beings are treated equally? Of course not, right? I think that a good chunk of American political history can be understood in terms of an effort to close the gap between Jefferson's ideal of equality, as expressed in the Declaration of Independence, and the reality of equality that we have in our daily lives. And let me just ask you, are we closer to that ideal of equality in 2019 than we were in 1787 when the Constitution went into effect? You say yes. Everybody say no? I think an objective observer would have to say we're closer today than we were then, but might quickly follow that by saying we're still not there and we're not even close to being there. Some might go that far and say, yeah, we got a lot of work. We got a long road to hoe, right, in that respect. I just mentioned that to you because I think that's an illustration of how we have undertaken as a civil society an effort to not water down the value of equality, but to raise the reality of equality to the value. So that's where we get debate in American political life, is over means to the value in. And there's lots of debate over means, and it's important debate. But I think we shouldn't forget in that debate, because the politicians aren't going to help us in this regard. Okay? Politicians are not, they're going to try to convince us that we're really different from one another. It is a more effective political strategy to divide than to unite, regardless of the rhetoric that some of them have. Okay? You can convince your base that those other people over there are different from you and that they are a threat to you. It probably serves your immediate political objectives better on either side. I'm not just talking about one side. I'm talking about both sides, if you can think about it in a dichotomous way. But it ignores the fact that Americans have historically, I think probably still to a large extent today, there's a great deal of continuity in terms of the fundamentals and what we believe as a civil society in terms of basic values. Okay, so again, we've said that an ideology poses two questions about government. What are the purposes of government and how much authority government should have? I've listed here three possible purposes of government. on this point here because I think the alarm's about to go off, so that we can take the quiz. I'll talk until it does. Okay. We could probably spend an entire week or more just listing specific things that government does and put it under this heading, the purposes of government. But to try to economize on time a little bit, as well as doing things a little bit better, I think most of those specific things that we would come up with would fit under one of these three headings. Okay? So I'm going to leave this up here for a second for you to get caught up if you're taking good notes. Okay? Yes, sir.
What does it say at the very bottom?
Oh, that was a problem. Whoever hung this thing didn't do a very precise job, did they? Okay, so this is the point that we'll begin with in Monday's class meeting. All right?